In the wake of the Oxford tragedy, as we mark tomorrow 2 weeks since the carnage there, a number of things legislatively underway. There is a bill that would reduce the size of magazines in the state of Michigan, that would try to restrict capacity of magazines. There's also a bill that would, a red flag law that would require that guns be taken away. There's also a child access prevention law that would insist that if you have a child in the family, that gun must be locked up. In this state, when it comes to child abuse, we have a mandatory reporting law that if a teacher suspects child abuse or neglect, it is not an option of whether or not they report it. They must report it under the law, or they face sanctions. And now we see something similar when it comes to reporting a threat in school, and it comes to us from Senator Ruth Johnson, Michigan Republican, who, of course, is our former Secretary of State as well. Senator Johnson, good morning.
Hi, how are you?
Very good. This, I guess I'm surprised. I had heard and I've seen reporting suggesting that we already have a mandatory reporting law for this. When you research this, is it too porous, or is it not clear enough, or is it merely a policy, not a law?
Yeah, this would make it crystal clear that the schools would actually would have to put in policies, and then they would have to make sure that all of their staff's trained. So really what it does would require mandatory reporting of threats in schools to law enforcement. And any school personnel that became aware of or had information that a reasonable person would feel constitutes an actual or implied threat of violence, there would need to be an immediate report to law enforcement. And they would need to report that threat to the police department with primary jurisdiction wherever the school is located. So my bill would also require all the school districts to train everybody, and they could take additional steps too if they felt that to address extra threats whenever they think it's appropriate. But if there's a threat of violence, law enforcement would have to be brought in. And I think that's a very, very important thing.
Well, I think it's very reasonable, and I still think it's, for so many of us, shocking that in light of the note that was found on the Tuesday morning 2 weeks ago, that this young man was not sent home, or that his book bag wasn't searched, and even more shocking, that the school liaison officer wasn't informed. How do you go about defining an implied or actual threat? Would his shopping for ammunition be an implied threat? And I mean, there's just so many ways that these things could be interpreted, and there's such a wide spectrum here.
You're exactly right. There is. So that's why I want to collaborate with our schools and with law enforcement on this, and to have open conversation about how do we do the best we can to keep our kids safe. Every child deserves a good education in a safe environment. This is just so important to make sure that we provide. So this is one way to do it. And, obviously there are questions over how the school handled things in the days and hours leading up to the shooting.
Sure.
And that's something that we'll probably get more on as it's being investigated by law enforcement and the prosecutor. But in my role as a legislator, I want to look at what steps we can take to try to prevent a tragedy like this from ever happening again in our state.
Well, I think it's incumbent on all of us to explore every avenue. Under the mandatory reporting law for child abuse, if a school administrator or teacher fails to report, it's punishable by up to 6 months in a county jail or a $1,000 fine. It's a misdemeanor. Do you have similar sanctions built into your Senate bill?
And that's one of the things that we're going to be working on, is what would be appropriate for not letting the law enforcement know. I mean, we need the expertise of law enforcement to look at things from that angle and evaluate a threat and take the appropriate actions. And another thing I'm working on in the Senate is additional funding for all our schools in Michigan, safety grants, which would be available for school districts to apply for to make upgrades to their facilities security. And this could include things like metal detectors, video cameras, special security locks for classrooms, which those door locks in Oxford were in place and really seemed to help keep a lot of students safe once they were in those classrooms.
They did. We also know, though, that there are many districts that don't have these school liaison officers This was addressed and nullified in less than 5 minutes. Um, I've heard some of your colleagues talk about arming teachers. I've heard from other school resource officers that think that's a terrible idea, but a highly trained resource officer can make a huge difference. I know there's a bill over on the House side that would increase funding for the training, recruitment, and placement of those school resource officers. Is that something you're going to get behind in the Senate?
Well, right now, the way the Bill 789 is set up is that they would need to report the threat to the police department with primary jurisdiction over wherever that school is located. And I think that's
Mm-hmm.
important. A lot of communities have their own small police department. Some rely on the Oakland County Sheriff. Some have state police. But with the money that I'm trying to get allocated, that would be something each school district would be able to determine for themselves.
Okay, so it could be for school resource officers. You would leave it up to them to suit whatever the needs are in that particular district.
That's right. You might have the high school right next to a police station, or, we have one township I found out when I was Secretary of State that only has 7 people that live in it up in the UP. So we
Right.
have much different type of state, and I think it's better to have local control and get the money to the schools and let them determine how best to serve the kids and parents that they're supposed to be serving.
I know as a former Secretary of State, you were concerned with the way that Governor Whitmer and her campaign team were using what is essentially a loophole that's been in existence in the law for some time now. It's actually not even a law. It was a Secretary of State's ruling dating back into the 70s, I believe, that said that if your campaign is under a recall threat, a lot of the limitations on individual donations can be ignored or can be lifted. What is the status of the legislation to change that portion of our campaign finance law and to kind of close that loophole?
Yeah, the loophole definitely needs to be closed. I don't think it was in the spirit of the law. Nobody's actively trying to recall the governor. It's a way to just simply go way over the limits. And even when she ran, she did a $2 million ad that was absolutely against the law. It was dark money, and she was found guilty. I always charged 100% fines when I was Secretary of State, no matter what party somebody belonged to. She got a 1.8% fine. So I think what we have to look at is government that's more transparent and more fair and far less partisan on things like this. This is just wrong.
Well, once the loophole is closed, if there is a violation of it, will you make the refunding of the money to the donor mandatory, or can they shift it to another, maybe just as partisan use?
Well, don't forget, any law we pass has to be signed by the governor. And she's going to want to use that money for partisan reasons. She is the second highest partisan in the United States as vice chair of the Democratic National Party, and wears the other half of the time, which is to work with both sides. It just doesn't work.
Well, of course, the shoe can quickly go on the other foot as well if Republicans were to find themselves under recall, and then you wonder what she would say then. Senator Ruth Johnson, we will follow this bill along through its course in the legislature. We know there are only a few days left. Senate Bill 789, which would mandate that an actionable threat, an implied threat, would be reported to authorities. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Guy. Have a great day.
I will.